Hey guys, I'm Sarah, and today I thought I'd do something a bit different, an experiment. I make bread. I make a loaf of bread almost every day. Our family of 5 goes through it. It is so much cheaper making my own bread. But today I'm going to look at different types of yeast because I get asked quite often about making my own yeast to make sourdough bread. I'm sorry, I've tried that many times and it's just, for some reason, for me, it's just not something I can maintain doing. So I always buy my yeast from the store. However, buying yeast from the store, it is still infinitely cheaper to make your own bread and it's nicer. You can pick what goes in it. But for this experiment, I am going to use 3 different types of yeast. If you want to know how to make different types of bread, I will link a video there, wherever it pops up. I have done a video on making wholemeal bread, grainy bread, all that. It's the same method, it's very simple. So this one I actually haven't tried before, Edmund's instant dry yeast, ideal for home bread makers. 12 sachets, I would say you just use 1 sachet per loaf. I'm going to be using the same recipe for each of these, just with the recommended amount of yeast. This is the stuff that I use on a regular basis, either this or I think there's an Edmund's version as well. I get whichever works out cheapest depending on the week. They're quite interchangeable. Breadmaker yeast, fast acting. So, and then there's this active dried yeast. Not sure what the packet stuff looks like, but of course this is just like lots and lots of little warbly bits. Ingredients wise, it's just 100% yeast. The bread maker's yeast, it's got like little floury bits in with it as well. So this one's actually 45% yeast. It's also got wheat flour, wheat bran, emulsifiers, flour treatment agent, and a few other things in there. So apparently it's basically bread improver. So it's got bread improver in there. I'm going to use, that'll be interesting because technically if I use the same recipe, I'm going to be using more yeast in this one, but then in this loaf it'll be less actual yeast, but with the bread improver mixture in there. I think you can actually buy bread improver separately on its own from the likes of Bin In, places like that. This stuff, as I say, I have not tried this before. Ingredients, it just says natural yeast and emulsifier. So I'll just be using 1 sachet. I'll put some yeast in each of these. So that's the yeast in there. It's a lot finer. It's a lot finer looking than that active yeast. What I normally do is I just use a dessert spoon and so you can definitely see the difference. That's the packet stuff. That's the active yeast. And that's the bread maker's yeast. So from there, I'm just going to make my standard bread. So, a couple of cups of warm water in each. A lot of people query the fact that I don't use sugar in my bread. If you find that you're making bread and your yeast just isn't activating, it's not rising as it should, then putting a bit of sugar in at this point can definitely help with that. Yeast feeds off sugar. Just to be fair on these two, because this one actually has a little bit of sugar in with the ingredients. So to be fair, I'm just going to put a teaspoon of sugar in with each, which I don't normally do, but I want to even the playing field. So I'm going to do it to all 3 of them. There's clear up. Now I'm not using special high-grade flour or anything. I just use plain flour with my bread. That's another thing you can, adjust if you're having issues with your bread making. try using high grade flour. It's a higher protein count. I find the price varies sometimes. Sometimes plain flour is cheaper than high grade. I usually just buy plain flour because it's what I get for all my other baking, and it doesn't seem to make much difference to me. I've been told it should make a difference, but this is just me and my experience. So I'm putting 4 cups of plain flour into each bowl. And I'll probably put a little bit more into each, just to get it to that stage where it's a dough ball, and I don't tend to knead this. This is a no knead recipe, but you do need to mix it, so I do tend to just do that by hand. So I guess you could say I do knead it, but not a great amount. So you know the yeast is good, it's starting to activate and go a bit frothy. Good to know. And then I just put, the amount of salt you put in is adjustable. I just put about a teaspoon per loaf these days. I did used to put more in, but a little bit of salt mixed in with the flour. I tend to mix the salt in with the flour a little bit first before I mix it into the rest of it, because salt can inhibit yeast a little bit. So I tend to mix that in with the flour before doing the dough ball. So normally with my bread, I actually do more of a mixture of white flour and wholemeal flour, and I often put linseeds or sunflower seeds or rolled oats in with it even. A bit of extra goodness in there rather than just the white flour, but I thought this was probably better for the sake of experimenting that I keep it simple. So they're all still a bit sloppy, so I'm just going to add a little bit more flour into each of those. Sprinkle it over like that. Make a nice soft dough ball. And then I'm going to cover these up. Just put a tea towel over each. Some people use cling film. That's fine, whatever. And then just leave it so it's noticeably rising. I usually let it about double in size. How quick mine rises also has to do with the temperature of the room. But I usually leave it for about an hour is usually enough. But this will be interesting to see if the different yeasts actually rise, you know, differently. Some may take longer than others. So I'll leave them for about an hour and see what happens. Okay, so it's been about an hour. I'm going to lift the lid here, see what's happening. Oh, actually that surprised me a bit. They've actually all risen up really nicely. I will confess I was expecting the one with the Breadmaker's yeast to rise up more than the others, but considering the different sized bowls, this one's a lot more spread out, you know, that one's, so it's hard to do a real comparison, but they've all spread up nicely. There's a bit more bubbles in these two. Interesting. So next thing I normally do is just put a little bit more flour on so I can handle them, shape them into a loaf type shape, put them on the oven tray, and I'll normally let them rise for maybe another 20 minutes and then put it in the oven for half an hour. Ideally, I'll be happy if these all yield very similar results. I was expecting the, as I say, I was expecting the one with the bread improvers in there to actually rise faster than the other two. Because I'm sure a while back when I first started making bread, I tried different yeasts and that one turned out to be the better one, or it was just the quicker one. So, interesting. Interesting. I wonder if it's something to do with the way you hold your tongue when you're doing it as well. Probably. So I'll just leave them for 20 minutes. Then I'll chuck them each in the oven see what results we get. Okay, so everyone's gathered round as though there's going to be taste testers.
We all know everything.
It actually surprised me because before I put them in the oven, it looked like they were doing very similar things. In the oven, the instant dry yeast and the active yeast, they're kind of pancaked. They spread, but they spread outwards, whereas the Breadmaker yeast, that made much more, it kept its structural integrity a lot better. So I'm just going to slice into these and just see what they look like on the inside. I mean, they're all going to taste the same because they all have the same ingredients apart from the yeast, and that won't make a huge difference to the taste of it. I would say if you're going to use either of these ones, which produced the flat bread, it may work better if you actually do it in a loaf tin, because then of course it'll keep its shape. It might just flatten out and spill over the sides a bit maybe. But yeah, I think I'm going to stick with this stuff because I like just forming it into a slug and putting it on an oven tray. Sounds so appealing. I'll link my standard bread video down below, but there we go. Hit like, leave us a comment, hit subscribe. Let me know. I know everyone's got their own variations with this sort of thing, so there we go, and we'll catch you next week. Bye.